Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message.
It's all about encounters. Throughout the whole Gospel of John, we get a variety of stories that share Jesus' words and actions. But all of these stories, all of these moments of his ministry are about encounters. Encounters with the disciples, Nicodemus, the unnamed woman at the well, Mary and Martha, the beloved disciple, John, even Mary, Jesus' mother. This list could go on and on and on. And in today's short reading, it is no exception. The words shared, the promise made by Jesus to his disciples, however, comes in the final hours of his life. You might ask why we have this particular passage as today's reading. It's a story about the end of Jesus' life, and we're past that. Easter has come and gone. Jesus has risen. So why aren't we reading stories and learning about the moments after Jesus was resurrected? Why are we dwelling on the before? But this passage is chosen today not at random, but with intention. There is an order sometimes to the stories we hear on Sunday mornings. And today we are reminded of the promise of the Holy Spirit, something that a lot of Lutherans don't spend a lot of time talking about. We like to focus on God and Jesus, and then there's kind of this weird Holy Spirit thing. But we have an image of a dove and fire, and it's kind of hard to understand what the Spirit is, what it does, what it looks like. But today we're reminded that the Spirit is what is always with us. It's what makes us never truly alone. And these words that Jesus is sharing with his disciples in these moments, he's preparing his friends, his family, for life after he is gone. For many centuries now, we as Christians have all relied on this promise as well. We have never been able to live in a time with the flesh and blood Jesus here among us. So we have had to sometimes lean deeply into that promise of love and truth that he speaks to his disciples. These last few years have taught many of us what isolation and loneliness can do to people. Being alone for extended periods of time takes a toll on us. We need to be around others, not just because we like to be social, but because when we are around other people, we encounter God. For many people, the isolation that was brought on by a global pandemic was the loneliest they had ever been. And yet, it doesn't take being physically away or apart from people to feel lonely. During my summers in college, I worked at a Bible camp. And my third summer, I worked there for 4, was very hard. I hesitate to say it was awful, but it was awful. At least the first half was. I was in a leadership position for the first time that summer on summer staff, and I had been in no way prepared for what that meant for me. No way prepared for how lonely and isolating it was to be in such a role. I had gone from being a part of the jokes and random conversations to having those things stop when I entered a room. It was eye-opening. To go from being the one following to the one leading, from the one with questions to the one with answers, from the one seeking support to the support giver, was a steep learning curve. And so when it came time for that midsummer break around the 4th of July, I went home for a few days. I needed time away from the pressure and the loneliness and the ugliness of what those 5 weeks had been for me. On the day I was supposed to go back to camp, I did absolutely everything I could not to, or at least to drag out that time. I took my time packing. I said really long, really good Minnesota goodbyes. I ran back into the house to grab one last thing time and time again. And finally, my mom, being the perceptive person she is, was like, "What's going on? What are you doing?" And so I shared how hard it was, that I was surrounded by people my own age. I was on a summer staff of about 60 people, and yet I had never felt more alone in my life. Surrounded by people, but alone. And I hated being the one on the outside looking in. I was exhausted from leading when no one else would step up to help. It was hard. And so, my parents drove me all the way back to camp, over 3 hours, just so that I wouldn't have to spend a hard drive all alone. They drove me back, dropped me off, and then turned around and went right back home. And those 3+ hours in a car were a gift to me in a time of deep distress. And as I reflect on those minutes spent in the car, I think about how my parents set an incredible example. That drive with them was just one of the many ways I have encountered the Holy Spirit and the love of God in my life. I was not alone then, and I am not alone now. And I did get through that terribly difficult summer with the help of my parents and some extraordinary friends. In fact, one of my best friends that I had met working at camp chose not to work there that year. She came back to volunteer for a few weeks, though. And we stayed up late talking more than once. We would read devotions before bedtime. We shared a room so that we could talk without disturbing those who had to be up earlier than us. And she showed me in more ways and in ways I didn't even know then or understand at the time how to work through some of those loneliness challenges that summer. She helped me form and strengthen my understanding of leadership. But most importantly, she, just like my parents, showed up. Both were encounters of the Holy Spirit, of the reminder that I am never truly alone. And maybe there are some of you joining us today that feel alone. Even if there are people around you singing the same words and praying the same words. Maybe there are some of you joining us today that feel alone because you are still living a life of complete or partial isolation. And maybe there are some of you who just feel alone. That's okay. Because today's story reminds us that Easter wasn't the end, but rather the beginning. Yes, we are Easter people. We celebrate that Jesus rose from the grave. He is risen indeed. But we do not stop there. We go on. We live on. And that is where we encounter that truth-revealing Holy Spirit. That is how we know that Jesus' promise is true. We are not alone. God is in our love and the love of others. It's all about the encounters. because each encounter we have, whether with the person sitting next to us or across the world on a screen, is how the Holy Spirit shows up among us. Love others as I have loved you. Today and every day, ask yourself, how did the Holy Spirit show up for me? For my family, for my friends, for my enemies. How did the Holy Spirit show up? Love others as I have loved you. That is the one commandment Jesus gives his disciples in the book of John. That is the commandment we are called to keep. That is how we know we are not alone.
That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.